Hey guys, Dakoba here with a raid leading guide for the Restless Cabal, the first boss in the Crucible of Storms raid and Battle for Azeroth. Now in this we're going to take a look at three different things. The first one is group composition and things you care about in terms of forming your group. Second, we're going to look at important assignments for you to give as group leader to different players within your group. And third, we want to look at what are the important calls to make during the fight. Now the first thing is group composition. For Restless Cabal, it turns out that the DPS requirements are very low, so your standard DPS comp should be fine, and you are okay to bring in whatever DPS you want. It is always, as always, it's helpful to have a warrior for their battle shout buff, a priest for power word fortitude, and a mage for arcane intellect, as well as a monk and demon hunter for the damage increase on the boss for physical and magical damage. Now this fight does have an interesting question in terms of tank composition. It has two bosses, and Cthulhu the Feared is a two tank boss. So you'll have your two tanks holding Cthulhu the Feared and swapping at two stacks. It's a very standard tank fight. Any tanks are fine for this. The second boss is Zaxaz the Speaker, and for Zaxaz, common wisdom is to use a ranged DPS for this role, and that definitely works for that. You can use any ranged DPS, but one with good survivability is best, so a Warlock or a Balanced Druid. And one thing you want to avoid here is to use a pet class. So Beastmaster Hunters and Demonology Warlocks actually split their threat with their pets, and that makes it very easy for a high DPS to rip off of them accidentally, so you want to avoid those particular ranged in that role. One thing we found very helpful for this is that if you're struggling with a ranged DPS in this role, you can go ahead and send a third tank, in particular a Paladin or a Guardian Druid or a Monk. Make a good third tank here because they have consistent ranged attacks, and you do want whoever's holding Zaxaz to be as far away from them as possible. They also have substantial self-healing, and their taunt and defensive cooldowns just give them a really good kit for dealing with this. And because the DPS requirement on this fight is so low, it doesn't really hurt the group to have a third tank in that role. As far as healing and defensive cooldowns go, you want as many as you can get. Shamans have a particularly strong kit with their Ascendants, their Healing Tide Totem, and their Spirit Link Totem, but any healing cooldowns should be fine here. As far as what assignments are important to make to the group, the important things you want to be watching for are the critical moments in the fight surrounding the bosses activating the different artifacts as well as their add abilities. So the three artifacts, the crown is the first one. For that one, you'll want healing cooldowns assigned to that. I recommend having at least 2 healing cooldowns going during this. If you have the defensive cooldowns to spare, it's not a bad idea to get a rally or a spirit link here as well. It's just very important that nobody in the group falls below 25% damage while the Storm of Annihilation is active. And so pairing off your healing cooldowns here is a good way to help keep the group topped off. If you're struggling to do this with just 2 healing cooldowns, you can go ahead and use whatever healing cooldowns you have here, and then simply separate the 2 casts of Storm of Annihilation by 3 minutes or more to give them time to come back off cooldown. So for example, have Cthulhu the Feared activated at the very beginning of the fight, and then have Zaxaz the Speaker activated at the very end of the fight, and that should allow those healing cooldowns to come back up if needed. The second ability that you need to be concerned about is the Void Stone. This creates a damage absorb shield on the boss that blocks all healing. This is really where you want to have at least 1 defensive cooldown available, a Rallying Cry or a Spirit Link, and it's also appropriate here to have players use their personal defensives and immunities if necessary. And then coming out of this phase, this is where you want that snap heal back. So a revival is a really good thing to have here from a monk healer. If you can have them wait until that damage shield falls and that healing block falls, and then have them revival to bring the group back up to full if necessary, is very helpful here. The third artifact, the Trident, doesn't require any special healing at all. Instead, that's where you'll want to use offensive cooldowns, but that should be should be pretty straightforward there. Use minor offensive cooldowns when Zaxaz activates the Trident, and you'll want to use heroism when Fthul does, simply because with Zaxaz you have that second add to cleave down. It's a lot easier to burn down the Trident's shield with 2 targets in it instead of just the one that Fthul provides. The other assignments you want to make are the interrupt assignments, and this is for the Fthul the Feared. Whenever he activates one of the artifacts, then he will summon 3 adds that need to have their cast staggered. For this, I recommend having the melee DPS interrupt the ad that is closest to the boss, the range DPS interrupt the ad that is sort of halfway away, and let the farthest one just finish its cast as soon as possible. In the event that the ads are clustered or not ideally positioned, go ahead and take the time during the fight to mark those ads and then call the interrupts individually, because that is one of the critical, that's probably the most critical point in the fight, is managing those interrupts correctly. That'll wipe groups more than anything else. Now, during the fight, the important calls you want to make are obviously handling those interrupts, so calling when Fthul is activating the artifacts and making sure that players are focusing on hitting those interrupts correctly. Again, it's the single most critical point of damage in the fight, and if it's mishandled, you will certainly wipe, so that has to be top priority while those ads are active. A second important call to make is for the various crowns, or various artifacts rather, and then when the crown is about to be activated, right before the boss phases, so at 76, 51, or 26%, call for the healers to dispel everybody who has the debuff on them currently. That debuff does reduce a player's health as it stacks up, and so while the crown's active, it's very easy for a player who has 5 or more stacks to get into that critical damage where they'll be killed instantly, and so it's best to have that taken care of going into the crown phase. And since healing or dispelling the debuff does damage the healers, you want to do that with just a couple second buffer to allow those healers to be healed back up before the crown starts. The other big call you'll want to make is for the second ad for Zaxaz the Speaker on Heroic. So Zaxaz the Speaker, when he activates an artifact, will summon an ad. This ad needs to be burned down fairly quickly, because if it finishes its cast, then the entire group will be feared for several seconds. Now, on normal, you simply need to burn this ad down once, and since it usually spawns right on top of the boss, it dies pretty easily, and then once it's been burned down, you can move on with your life. The ad will despawn before it heals and finishes a second cast. In Heroic, it will have time to finish that second cast, and so once the ad heals back up to full health, it needs to be focused down a second time, and so make sure you call for the group to swap back after the ad has healed. Once it's been killed a second time, you can resume DPS on the boss. It may heal back and start the third cast, but it will not finish the third cast in Heroic. As far as timing of major abilities go, you'll want to use offensive cooldowns during the Trident, again healing cooldowns during the Crown, and defensive cooldowns during the Voidstone. We recommend using Heroism for the Trident on Fthul, just to make sure that you burn that shield very quickly. And then once all 3 artifacts have been activated for both bosses, stack them up and burn them evenly. They do have to die within about 10 seconds of one another in order to end the fight. That'll do it for today. If you guys have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks for hanging out, and y'all have a good afternoon.